My name is Lavey and I serve as the Director of Jewish Life here at the Peninsula Jewish Community Center. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to our annual Rabbis Roundtable, this year focusing on the story of Sarah Hagar. For many of us, the Rabbis Roundtable has become a central part of our high holiday preparations. And I'm so glad that you have joined together for this evening of community and learning. I also want to share with you the very exciting news that this coming year, the North Peninsula Jewish Community Scholar in Residence will be Rabbi Daniel Hartman. Oh my God. That's the proper response. Rabbi Hartman is the president of the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, and he is one of Israel's most important commentators on religion, ethics, and Israeli society. He will be in our community from February 9th through 18th, and you can look forward to more information being forthcoming in the near future. And the information we gather is of great importance to our funders, the Koret Foundation and the Tova Philanthropies, whose generous support makes all our Jewish Life programs possible. Tonight we will explore and discuss the biblical story of Hagar and Sara. This story, which is read in many synagogues on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, raises important questions about family relationships, who is worthy to receive the covenant, and even the relationships between Muslims and Jews, to name just a few. You should all have received a copy of the text as you came in this evening so that you can read the story for yourselves and refer to it during the program. This evening we are privileged to have with us 5 leading spiritual leaders from our community who will teach us about and share with us their most personal responses to and beliefs about this Torah story's meaning and its relevance. Our teachers tonight will be Rabbi Rabbi Eisner and Rabbi Sarah Mason-Barkin from Peninsula Temple Bethel, Rabbi Dan Feeder from Peninsula Temple Shalom, Rabbi Cory Helfand from Peninsula Sinai Congregation, and Rabbi Ezray from Congregation Beth Jacob. My colleagues and I are especially pleased that for the first time we have a woman rabbi as a member of the panel. Yes, that's also the proper response. A special welcome to Rabbi Mason-Barkin. I want you to consider for just one moment what it says about our community. That rabbis of different denominations come together publicly to study and learn with each other. And in so doing, they bring the entire Jewish community together. I think it reflects that we are a remarkable, open-minded, pluralistic, and collaborative community. We can be very proud of this achievement. It also means a great deal that 2 weeks before Rosh Hashanah, they're taking the time to be here with us, to learn together in community. What a gift to all of us. The format for our evening is as follows. Each panelist will have 10 minutes or less.
That was funny.
To present his or her views on the story of Sarah and Hagar. After each panelist has spoken, we will take questions from the audience. If you do have a question for our panelists, you can please write it down on the index card which you have been given. We will collect the cards after each of the panel members speak, and I will ask the questions, your questions to the panel. I'm now going to invite Rabbi Helfand to come forward to blow the shofar for us to set the mood for our Elul study together.
I think this is the 4th year that we've done this, but we've never blown the shofar. So it's time for a new minhag. If I could invite all of you to stand if you're able. And just to set the tone for the story, and I hope that I'm not stealing anyone's content here, but the sounds of the shofar are also symbolic of the journey that we go on for the high holidays, starting with one full sustaining blast, the tikiyah, and then the broken blasts of the shvarim, the 3 blasts, and then the shuvah, the 9 short, chaotic blasts that represent the utter destruction and brokenness in the world. So hopefully we'll get back to that tikiyah, and even the tikiyah gedolah, that sense of strength and shleimut through the journey, which you will probably see quite a bit in the story that we study this evening. And I hope it's the journey that we are each able to embark on as we enter the new year together.
Rabbi Dan Feeder will be our first teacher.
Good evening, everybody. So I wanted to start by first thanking Lavey Darby, a wonderful pulpit rabbi for many decades before he has been blessing us here at the PJC, because he is not only a terrific director of the rabbinic director of the PJCC, but he gives all of us the opportunity to come together and collaborate on a special program. We're glad that you're here, and let's begin with a blessing of the study of Torah, ending with the words La'asok v'divrei Torah. Please join me if you're familiar. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok v'divrei Torah. Praised are you, Adonai our God, ruler of the universe, who makes us holy with the mitzvot and commands us to engage ourselves in the study of Torah. So, although we are focusing, can't hear? Can you hear in the front row? Okay. Are other people having trouble? Okay. Other people say they're hearing, so that's okay. So, although we are focusing our thoughts on chapter 21 of the book of Genesis, verses 1 through 34, and that's the story, of course, of Sarah and her Egyptian handmaiden Hagar, it really begins all the way back in chapter 12, because it's in the early part of Parashat Lech Lecha, when Avram and Sarai, and at this point in the story, Abraham is still Avram, Sarah is still Sarai, go down to Egypt because there is a famine in the land of Canaan. When he passes off his wife Sarai as his sister in order to protect himself, Abraham then sees his wife taken as a concubine by the Egyptian Pharaoh, and we are told that this is because she was a very beautiful woman. The text then tells us that things went very well for Avram because of this, and he acquired sheep, oxen, asses, male and female slaves, she-asses, and camels. In other words, one of the possessions that Avram garnered, having passed his wife off as his sister, her being taken into the concubinage of the Pharaoh, is the slave handmaiden, Hagar. And in the words of the medieval Bible and Talmud commentator from Spain, Rabbi Moses ben Nachman, 13th century, we should know that, quote, our father Abraham inadvertently committed a great sin by placing his virtuous wife in a compromising situation because of his fear of being killed. He should have trusted in God. So, not only does Sarah have a horrible memory of a terrible episode in her life, but now she has a person, her servant, her slave, her handmaiden, who is a permanent reminder of that awful episode. Note also that there may be, we're not exactly sure, but there may be a wordplay in the name Hagar, because in the Hebrew, Ha and Gar, if you change the vowel under the gimel to Ezray, you get Hagar, the stranger, the foreigner. And as long as she is with Abraham and Sarah in Canaan, she is indeed the outsider, the foreigner, the stranger. The story picks up in chapter 16. Sarai, still named Sarai at this point, we're told has not borne Avram a child yet, And she is despairing. She says, look, the Lord has kept me from bearing. Consort with my maid. Perhaps I shall have a son through her. Avram did as she said. And the text tells us that she gave Hagar to Avram as a concubine. He fathered a son who would of course be named Ishmael. There's a real emphasis throughout this story on senses. Ishmael means God hears. That's the first of the senses that the text is drawing us towards. As soon as Hagar is pregnant, though, there are problems. Beginning with verse 4, there's a really interesting repetition of words related to seeing, to eyes, to vision. And I think this bears incredible metaphoric importance for us during this season, the Yamim Noraim. When we do a lot of thinking, and our vision casts both back in time and forward in time as we try to redirect our actions and thoughts for the better as we do Teshuvah in the new year. In verse 4, when Hagar sees that she has conceived, Sarai is lowered in her esteem. Literally, when she saw Vatera, this, Sarai was lowered in Hagar's eyes, the Einecha. And in verse 5, Sarai uses the exact same words with the exact same sense of seeing and vision to lament to Avram the wrong that he has done to her. She says, I myself put my maid in your bosom. Now that she sees that she is pregnant, I am lowered in her eyes. And this environment sets the tone for the prime focus today, chapter 21. God, we're told at the beginning of the chapter, takes note, hakad, of Sarah. And this is an important word choice, and I'll come back to that. Abraham and Sarah, of course, become parents of a son named Isaac. He's circumcised on day 8. At age 3, he is weaned, which seems to be a very festive occasion. Apparently, this is a moment worthy of a feast. And at this point in the story, if you can imagine it, Ishmael would be about 17, Abraham about 103, Sarah about 93. Sarah notes that the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, note that Ishmael, is not identified in the text here in verse 9. He is identified in relationship to his mother. Playing, and the verb is mitzachek, a wordplay, an obvious wordplay, on Isaac's name, Yitzchak. And this riles her, Sarah that is, to the point that she says, cast out that slave woman and her son, for the son of that slave shall not share in the inheritance of my son Isaac. Note that as the firstborn, he's entitled to a share of his father's estate. And the commentators tend to interpret this negatively on Ishmael, noting that Sarah, according to the Chafetz Chaim, 19th century Lithuania, feared the danger of Ishmael corrupting the younger brother Isaac. And some sages justify Sarah's behavior by interpreting the word playing as a reference to Ishmael's cruelty and lewdness, perhaps even sexual molestation. That's in Genesis Rabbah, chapter 57, paragraph 11. But in my eyes, that places a whole lot of weight on a simple word, mitzacheh, or play. Another interpretation from the Berkeley Bible professor Robert Alter that I like is that Ishmael was playing, mitzacheh, at being Isaac. What does that mean? He was comporting himself as if he were Abraham's heir and the continuer of the covenant. This distresses Abraham greatly. The text informed us because this matter concerned his son. God tells him, though, don't be distressed over the boy or your slave. Whatever Sarah tells you to do, do as she says. And this, of course, would be the ultimate proof text for Jewish women ever after to say to their husbands, God tells Abraham to do this, so should you. God comforts him by saying, it is through Isaac, not Ishmael, that offspring shall be continued for you. As for the son of the slave woman, note that God doesn't say, note for your son. God says, note the son of the slave woman. I will make a nation of him too. for he is your seed. Abraham's comforted, Abraham's been instructed, so now he wakes up early. And the text of the Torah doesn't tell us very often that somebody woke up early. And when the text does tells us that, there's great meaning. It means that that person is eager to fulfill that action, that commandment, so to speak. So he wakes up early, takes some bread, a skin of water, gives them to Hagar. Can you imagine the scene here? He sends them away, places the water and the bread over her shoulder, together with the child, casts them away. She wanders aimlessly, the text tells us, in the wilderness of Beersheba. And when the water was gone from the skin, she leaves her son, who's not a little boy now, he's 17 years old, down at a distance, a bow shot away, thinking to herself, let me not look down as the child dies. She bursts into tears, and then, remember what we talked about in terms of senses. The text tells us that God heard the cry of the boy. That's once again God taking notice. She leaves her son under the bushes, thank you. She goes down, the text tells us that God heard the cry of the boy. An angel of God calls from heaven, asks her what troubles her, to fear not, God has heeded the cry of the boy. She is told, come, lift up the boy, hold him by the hand. Then the text tells us that after the angel has comforted her, God opened her eyes. Note again the emphasis on vision. And she saw a well of water. She went, filled the skin with water, and let the boy drink. The text continues to tell us that he grew up strong, became so strong that many nations came from him. Now, the text doesn't tell us that God performed a miracle by making the well then and there. The remarkable thing seems to be is that she is now able to see that which she could not see before. This is God opening the eyes of the blind, not through a miracle, but giving them the mental capacity to have vision of something that they were previously closed off to. What a fantastic metaphor this is for the High Holy Days. When we are called by our tradition and called upon ourselves to look at things in a way that we could not possibly fathom at earlier situations in our life, at earlier scenes in our life. So, the last thing I want to say related to the High Holy Days is that later on in the story, in the book of Genesis, after Sarah dies, we're told that Isaac is living in a place, Be'er Lahai Rui. Well, that's exactly where Hagar is dwelling. We're then told that Abraham marries a woman named Keturah. To the rabbis of the Midrash, this is a wonderful opportunity to make Abraham right a previous wrong. Who is Keturah? Say some of the rabbis of the Midrash, she is none other than Hagar. And this was Isaac's helping Abraham to right his maltreatment of Hagar. So just as Abraham rights the wrong, does teshuvah, and remarries Hagar, now known as Keturah, this is the Midrash, of course, not the text itself, we are also capable of righting our wrongs at this time of year, redirecting our orientation. Thank you.
Our second teacher will be Rabbi Cory Helfand.
Are you familiar with Google Glass? Google Glasses? If you're not familiar with it and you happen to have an extra $1,500 lying around, you should go purchase Google Glasses, because what they allow you to do is gain a very interesting perspective into life, really through the point of view of you, but the way that you are recording life as it's actually happening. And you can tell Google Glass to record at any moment or to take a picture at any moment, and then you can watch back what your eyes were seeing when it was actually happening. Very apropos Rabbi Feder's comments about the senses. So if you have $1,500 and you can go buy them, it's a great way to be able to experience the world. And if you have an extra $1,500, you can buy me a pair. I use that as the frame to think about the story this evening because of its complexity. And the way that we see the world is really through that lens of complexity. There is no such thing as a simple relationship, and really it is a story about relationship. I want to read to you the introduction that's in the new Machzor of the conservative movement that was published a couple of years ago. The Torah does not present us with an idealized heroic family, but rather offers us a domestic scene with clashing personalities and motives that can be variously interpreted as selfless or selfish. The ambiguity allows us to consider the complexity of our own motivations and how difficult it is to understand ourselves and others. In any given year, we may identify with Abraham or Sarah or Hagar or the children Isaac and Ishmael. As we change, so may our sympathies with the different characters. And the way that I read this story is very much through the lens of the relationship. The relationship that I have with others, the relationship that I have with the characters in the Bible, the relationship that I have with people as my life continues to unfold. And very much like Rabbi Feder started with, you can't read this story without reading the story that happens before and the story that happens after. It's very interesting that for the high holidays they pick a very select text for us to study, but you really don't understand the content of it if you don't have a clear understanding of the way the context was set. And I think that's one of the reasons why you have to go back and read the story. To isolate one particular passage over another does not do justice the tremendous depth and meaning and complexity of the relationships as they unfold. It's very similar to reading a book. Over the course of reading any story, the characters change based on their relationships with one another, the way that they react to each other. And I think that that's where you have to start. For you on Rosh Hashanah, for me on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we have to think about our narrative through the lens of where we've come from and the lens of where we're going. And how over the course of time, our sense of self, how we see ourselves, has evolved through all of that. So I want to offer that as a framework for the remarks that I have to share. Rosh Hashanah is called by many different names, including Yom HaZikaron, the Day of Remembrance, as well as the Zichronot section that is chanted in the Musaf, thinking about the importance of memory. One of the interesting points about this particular Torah reading is how it starts. V'Adonai Fakad et Sara. God remembers, God takes note of Sarah. It's a very intimate choice of words. And the focus of remembrance, of memory, on the main characters, actually all women, is very important. There's the remembrance of Sarah, the importance of the story that we read back earlier at the beginning of Vayera, when we have three angels who come to tell of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and to check on Abraham after his Brit Milah, his circumcision, but also to tell Sarah that she will have a child. And the importance of God coming back and saying, I remembered my covenant with you, so I'm going to make sure that it is fulfilled. There's the remembrance of Hagar, when she is first banished after Sarah says to cast her away into the wilderness, and then the second time when she's cast aside and banished into the wilderness. And also in the Haftarah, in the selection that's read on day 1 from the prophets, the opening of Samuel, it's the remembrance of Hannah, who is also barren and unable to have children, and God remembers her and blesses her with the son of Samuel. So in a way, memory is one framework for thinking about the story. And it's important, actually, that the story starts this way because it's a rabbinic principle, a midrashic principle known as midah keneged midah, measure for measure. Whenever God says that something's going to happen, God wants to make good on that promise. And just as God promises Sarah that she will have a son, the first scene on the story is that it's going to happen. Of course, she laughs and she makes a joke about the whole thing, but we all know what's to come. But I think that part of setting the stage is that we have to think about the dynamic complexity of our relationships. And part of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur is remembering that. It says, there's a beautiful way of thinking about this, that in order for us to remember how we connect to God, to perpetually be on a journey in our relationship with God, we have to remember how we relate to other people. And this story sets the framework for how to do that. How Sarah relates to Hagar, how Hagar relates to Abraham, how Abraham relates to Sarah, and then of course how the boys relate to one another. It's only through Sarah, through remembering Sarah, that Abraham becomes who he is. Abraham cannot become the patriarch, like the patriarch, if Sarah doesn't have a baby. There is no fulfillment of the brit, of the covenant, without Sarah's role. And therefore the story starts, Va'adonai pakad et Sarah. It's not just remembering the fulfillment of the covenant. In a way, Sarah remembers, and God remembers, the whole story that is about to unfold. So we can't read the story without the past, and we also have to be aware of what happens in the future in order to understand the present, at least as we read the biblical narrative. But there's something a little bit more complex about this. As the story unfolds, Abraham's temperament changes radically. Remembering conjures up all kinds of uncertainty and confusion and anger and frustration in Abraham because of what his wife Sarah asks him to do. Abraham's joy vanishes when he has to send Hagar out into the wilderness, not once but twice. And just as Abraham must for the rest of his life bear this responsibility of the way that he engages with his maidservant, so too are we supposed to think about the consequences that come with our relationships. You can't just make a decision and not realize the consequence, the impact that it has on the other. And in this particular story, it's all about the other, the way that we think about those people. There's a beautiful teaching by Dr. Michelle Friedman. She's the Director of Spiritual Care and Counseling at Yeshivat Chovevei Torah, the Modern Orthodox Rabbinical School in Riverdale. And she says, reconstruction of a personal narrative does not alone suffice. Rather, it is a necessary prelude to the restitution and hopefully restitution and reconciliation of the self. Only after acknowledging the complexities of our heart and shouldering the responsibility to make amends for thoughts, speech, and action that cause hurt to others can we truly stand in the heavenly court and hear the triumphant cry of the shofar. In a way, this story requires us to begin doing the hard work that I could imagine Abraham and Sarah having to do if they were standing before God on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. But remembrance is not just about thinking, it's about seeing, it's about listening, about the senses that Rabbi Feder talked about. But it's more than that. It's about hearing voices. I'm not talking about in the crazy kind of way. I'm talking about really being able to be present with another person and listening to them. Really hearing a person in a way that is empathic and in a way that demonstrates presence. And it's really a very difficult thing to do. It requires us opening our eyes. Vayifkach Elohim et eineha. Just like Hagar had to open her eyes and see that which was already there, being present for somebody else is not just about listening and knowing what you're going to say in response, but it's about pausing for just a moment and actually hearing what the other person is saying. It's a trap that we often run into because we're so focused on how we're going to answer that which is being said on the other side of things. And that's exactly what God does. It's interesting that Hagar is the one who cries, but God hears Ishmael. It's a very powerful response, and in a way it makes me think that God is able to hear people even when they are silent. If we could only strive to do that blessing which God is able to offer Ishmael and Hagar in that moment, how powerful would it be for us to be able to join in another person's pain, to really hear them and see them in their moment of anguish in the same way that God is able to do for Ishmael and for Hagar. Something else that I found really striking about this story was about names. There's a lot of name changing that happens in this story. Sarai becomes Sarah, Abram becomes Avraham, but Hagar does not change her name. Avraham and Sarah change their name in entering into this breed, into this covenant with the people, but Hagar doesn't change her name. And the question is why? Rabbi Feder alluded to the idea that maybe it's a reference to Hagar, the stranger. But if you look at the way the words are spelled, Avram becomes Avraham, a hey is added, indicative of God's name. And Sarai also gets a hey, indicative of God's name. But Hagar had the name there already. The hey is already in her name, as if to say God's presence was with her. How do we know this? There's a beautiful teaching that suggests that Hagar, unlike Abraham or Sarah, she was able to name God. She calls God El Roi, the God that sees. And because she was able to give God this name, she actually knew that God was with her all along. That's something that's different that Abraham and Sarah were unable to see, that Hagar already knew existed within her from the outside.
Mason-Barkin.
Hello. Good evening. Can you hear me? Can you see me? All right. So am I loud enough? First of all, thank you again, not only to Rabbi Darby, but also to all of my colleagues here for welcoming me for the first time onto this panel and for being nice, because I'm giving you that ahead of time. I'm setting the expectation because this is my first time doing something like this, and I'm so honored to be a part of it and so happy to be here tonight. It's really been interesting taking another look at this text. This was actually my bat mitzvah portion. And I remember reading the story and thinking how cool it was that my bat mitzvah portion was about Sarah, because of course I am Sarah. So in reading this portion, it's very difficult for me to separate them. Difficult, but I have this tendency to really look for myself in the text, because there, on some level, I expect to have a kinship with Sarah, because I'm also Sarah. Now, as an adult, I look at the text again, and I see not only my name there, but I see a story about women, the community that I'm a part of. I see a story about mothers. I see this. Does that mean I'm not being loud enough?
Right.
Thank you. I see a story about women, a community that I'm a part of. I see a story about mothers, a community that I'm a part of. And I think that this is not just for me as a woman and as a mother, but I think that in each one of us, when we take a look at this story, as in many stories, we see ourselves. So I'd like you to take a moment and just think. If you can ever remember a time in your life where you had some kind of complicated family situation. And I hear chuckles. Does that mean you've been there? You see yourself in this text. Anyone here ever felt jealous? Anyone here ever had a moment of self-doubt? Anyone here have a very close, today's kids, they call this a frenemy? Someone who you felt very, very close with, but also on some level had some kind of difficulty with, some kind of competition with, perhaps. Frenemy. This is a story about all of those things. All of these places that each of you, frenemy maybe you were not so sure about, but each of the other ones, you've seen yourself there. You've seen yourself in these situations. Perhaps you've never quite been in a situation just like that, but you have seen yourself in this text. This is a story about two women. We've got women here, we've got people here who know women. This is a story about complicated family dynamics. Certainly we see that in the complication between Sarah and Hagar, trying to figure out how to live together and be a part of this family when the deal that they've been given is so difficult. We see a story about jealousy. We see Sarah so jealous that Hagar was able to give her husband what she really, really wanted to give to him. We see self-doubt. Anyone who has ever expected to become something and then not become that. I'm thinking about stories of infertile women who expected that someday they would become mothers and then didn't have that experience. That is a tremendous experience of self-doubt and wondering, why is it that I can't become what I've always been expected to become? And I believe that Sarah experienced that. And this is a story of sisterhood. This is a story about two women who were in it together and yet had this intense competition, intense struggle with each finding their place within the family. And we see this trope almost to the letter repeated in the story of Leah and Rachel, two sisters who were married to the same man. There was the barren sister who was loved by her husband, and then there was the fertile sister, unloved by her husband, each one taking part in this relationship, together wishing that perhaps they could offer the whole package. A very difficult story, but certainly a story that we can each find some way to relate to between ourselves. So when we look at the humanity, because that's what this is a story about what it means to be human. We wonder, how exactly did we get to be here? What is it that brought us to this very place where we see such humanity? How is it that Hagar ended up in this situation? How is it that Sarah allowed for this to happen? And we've already, I picked 3 midrashim to share with you. We've already heard about 2 of them. So I'll remind you, just in case. Thank you, Rabbi Peter. You really set me up. I appreciate it. The first, we heard a story about Hagar being given to the family of Abraham and Sarah because of what happened back in Egypt. So I'll share with you, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai said, Hagar was Pharaoh's daughter. Similar. When Pharaoh saw what was done on Sarah's behalf in his own house, he took his daughter and gave her to Sarah, saying, better let my daughter be a servant in this house than a mistress in another house. He thought so highly of Abraham and Sarah. Thus it is written, she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. And Pharaoh said, now we hear another play on words, here is your reward, Hagar. So the word Hagar is somehow wrapped up in Hagar's name, Hagar. So on one hand, perhaps Hagar is a reward, and this is really quite a delightful situation that everybody's thrilled about. We have yet another explanation for how we ended up in this place, why rational, theoretically, human beings would have ended up in such a complicated situation, or how that might have been for them. And as follows. Sarah dealt harshly. Rabbi Abba said she restrained her from cohabitation, so she kept Hagar from being with Abraham. Rabbi Barachia said she slapped her face with a slipper. Rabbi Abba said she made her carry water buckets and bath towels to the bath. So they ended up in this situation, perhaps amicably at first, but it really deteriorated quite quickly. And we saw Sarah, our matriarch, who we're supposed to model ourselves after in some way, really acting in quite a terrible way. And then the last interpretation of how we ended up here. How did we come to be in this situation? And this Rabbi Peter also mentioned, and Rabbi Helfand as well. So, great minds. Rabbi Judah said, this was Hagar. Said Rabbi Nehemiah to him, but it was written, and her name was Keturah. This implies she united Keturah, piety and nobility in herself. So once again, perhaps Hagar was a part of this relationship as a true love relationship. And that Abraham and Hagar, later Keturah, were able to be reunited. And that this was not some kind of situation of force, but rather that Hagar and Abraham truly loved each other, as Abraham and Sarah did as well. And that is how we ended up in this place, in this very complicated situation. But the question that I kept asking myself as I was reading these interpretations and trying to figure out why it is that we're reading what we're reading, and why is it that we're reading about people who are just like us? What's there to take from this? And why now? Why on Rosh Hashanah, or tonight leading up to the Yomim Noraim, why are we reading about such humanity now? Shouldn't we be sort of focusing higher? Shouldn't we be trying to think about where we're aiming to and not necessarily where we've come from? I want to, as my colleagues suggested to do, we need to look at the whole text. We need to see that there's more to each of these stories than the initial section that we're taught to read on a specific day and at a specific time. So I want to fast forward just very slightly. And I want to look at a couple similarities between this scenario that we have with the banishment of Hagar and Ishmael and what comes up next in our text, which is the story of the Akedah, when Abraham goes to take his son Isaac to sacrifice him at God's suggestion on top of the mountain. So as one of my colleagues mentioned, Hagar gets up very early in the morning. This is a very specific moment when you see someone rise so early in the morning to go and take care of something you know is very important. We see this happen in the story of Hagar taking Ishmael away. We also see this when Abraham goes up to the top of the mountain to sacrifice his son. Which, by the way, in case, spoiler alert, he doesn't do it, just in case. We see once again a child in danger, a parent leaving their child in a dangerous situation. So first, Hagar leaves her son Ishmael. We read it and we think he's a child. Perhaps he's a teen. We have that same conundrum in the story with the Akedah when we see Isaac being taken up the mountain. Maybe he's a teen, it makes sense, timeline-wise, but when we read it, we picture him as a child. And we see that child in danger at the hands of the parents. The mother leaving the child thirsty, or the father taking a knife to slaughter his own child. And then again, at the end of each story, we see divine intervention. In the story of Hagar and Ishmael, God hears Ishmael crying, and it comes in to change that situation, provide the water so that Ishmael will not die of thirst. And then in the story of the Akedah, the story of the binding of Isaac, God at the last moment provides the ram to be the sacrifice so that Isaac will not die at the hands of his father. So we see these two stories that seem so different. We see a mother and a son, we see a father and a son. They're sort of different situations, and yet there are these stark similarities. And we read them in there are communities that read each of these stories on Rosh Hashanah. So we're taking these lessons in specific periods of time that are similar. So Rabbi Amitai Adler, who's a rabbi on the North Shore of Chicago, offers an answer. 2 minutes, that was so fast. Oh my gosh. Okay, so Rabbi Adler offers a suggestion, not about Sarah, not about Hagar and Ishmael, but about Abraham and Isaac, and why we read this story in Rosh Hashanah. He suggests it's to help us understand tochacha, which means rebuke. We read this story because rebuke is part of what we do on the high holidays, rebuke of the things that we've done wrong over the past year. And the story of the binding of Isaac is a moment to rebuke Abraham for not standing up to God, and a moment to rebuke God for suggesting that Abraham ought to be in this position. Now we look back to Sarah and Hagar. Is this a story of rebuke? Quite possibly. Quite possibly, this is a story of rebuke for the characters involved in the story. And as we look back to where we started, this story is about Sarah and Hagar. But truly, this story is about us. We see ourselves in each of the basest moments that Hagar and Sarah encounter. There are times when we find ourselves there. A far-fetched story, but each individual moment not so far away from where each one of us is. Neither Sarah nor Hagar is more moral than any one of us. We are not more godly or more in touch with divinity than they are. We are Sarah when we feel jealous. We are Hagar when we don't speak up for ourselves. We are Sarah when we act out, and we are Hagar when we feel silently prideful. We are Sarah and Hagar when we hurt and when we are hurt. As we look towards the new year, the text shows us their humanity, and it shows us our own humanity. And it points to us to tell us that we too can do better. We too can look towards this new year and find ways to improve ourselves in the most human ways we can. Thank you.
Our next teacher is Rabbi Nat Ezray.
So, one word of acknowledgement. Often rabbis will come to this area, they'll move in, they'll say, wow, you guys really, really get along. And you really care about each other, and you really love each other, and you really love working together. And this is an incredibly unique community, and I think all of you realize that. Of incredible respect and love amongst colleagues and friends. So it's great to be here tonight. It's great to have our minds and our hearts stimulated by different points of view. I have a different do you remember question. Do you remember when your kid was born? I know not everybody here has kids, but I can't tell you how happy that first moment of holding on to that newborn was. You know, when we had a scary birth, it was an emergency C-section, but you know, all was well. You hold the baby. And that joy of holding your baby is right there. God's brought me laughter. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. There's a great feast, huzzah! And I want to feel the joy of new life and new beginnings. And all of a sudden, life changes in a nanosecond. In a nanosecond, we move from this joy and this feast to a moment where life changes in a second. She sees Ishmael, she meaning Sarah, mitzacheking. And I'll come back to that word in a second. And she says possibly one of the harshest lines that you will ever read. Go to verse 10. Garesh et ha'amah hazot. Cast out that slave woman. Ve'et bana. And her son, Kilo Yirash ben ha'amah hazot. That son of the slave woman will not inherit im bani with my son, im Yitzchak, with Isaac. Everything changes in a moment. We go from joy to expulsion. We go from cradling a beautiful child who has name, Yitzchak, to sending out a human being without even giving him a name. Well, let's stop for 1 second. Life changes in a moment. It's how you act in those moments that define everything. My mom was walking out of the garage, and my father left a bottle on the stairs, and she just tripped, and she broke her foot. And it was a bad break. She was off her foot for 6 weeks. Everything changed in a moment. In a moment. Now, God bless my mother. We get to the hospital, and she says, you know, the fireman who came was a very handsome young man. But everything changed in a moment. Suddenly this independent, strong woman who would go exercise every day was, you know, in the house. And she really couldn't care for herself in certain ways. And I think about how things change in a moment, and it's how you react when those moments come. And you can never know, you can never plan, but it's how things change in a moment that this text is about. And then the next moment is a moment that gives me the chills. I want to hear a little more outrage. How could Sarah have done this? Note that she will not call him by his name. You know, what does she call him? Son of the slave woman. The son of a slave shall not share in the inheritance. What's she worried about? Her little baby. And in so doing, she dehumanizes him and takes away his name. You know? It feels like in the world today there's a lot of dehumanizing of people who we make other. Hagar, the other. Oof, he's other. He is competition. No way. And maybe we need to have a little outrage at how we get so hyper-focused on our own needs that we don't see others for their humanity, for their potential. You know, yeah, let's apologize for Sarah. Let's be outraged at Sarah. Well, you know, when my outrage lasts for a few minutes, there are years when I am more outraged, particularly years when the turning of someone into other is more prevalent, and this is one of those years. But I want to hold on to the ambiguity and complexity that says, you know what? Maybe that person who I have expressed my outrage, anger at, isn't so terrible. So the word was presented. You go to this next line. Vatere Sara. Sarah saw. I'm going to come back to that. Resh, Aleph, Hey. She saw. Maybe she saw what I couldn't see. Et ben Hagar, the son of Hagar, HaMitzri, the Egyptians, Asher Yaldad Abraham, Mitzachek. He was mitzacheking. He was mitzacheking, and the only way you can translate that word is mitzacheking. Maybe indeed it refers to other places where we see the word, because you know at the Mount Sinai we were mitzacheking around that idol. Maybe he was doing a little idolatry, and when you study the word, it opens up the possibilities. Something really wrong was going on. Mitzachek, when it was talking about Isaac and Rebekah, they were having a little sexual dalliance. The word's used in terms of Lot and his son-in-laws. Maybe there was some sexual immorality that was going on here. Maybe there was idolatry going on here. Maybe Alter's translation, he was mitzacheking, he was pretending to be Isaac, and she suddenly got, oh my God, this kid really will create such discord in the family. Such discord when it comes to inheritance. Such discord when it comes to leadership. Such discord when it comes to perpetuation of the people. Because she knew from the previous chapter, and this hasn't been said yet, in chapter 17, God said to her, the inheritance will be through Isaac. Maybe she saw what Abraham couldn't see because he so loved Ishmael. He was so blinded. Maybe, and this is also in the Machzor of the conservative movement, the Machzor lived Shalom. She was the woman who saw how things would play out and did the courageous act in order to prevent that. By the way, we rabbis, all of you in your professions and in your families, have those moments where nobody's going to understand what you had to do. And it's not going to be popular, and people aren't going to like it, and you have to do it for the greater good. And for me, the high holidays of saying, is there something that I need to muster up the courage to do that people aren't going to understand and aren't going to like? Maybe that is exactly what Sarah needed to do. And I want to hold on to the ambiguity of damn her. How could she do such a heinous, terrible, reprehensible, immoral act? And bless her. What a courageous woman who helps us muster up courage at times when no one will understand us. But I think that this word hinges on the concept of seeing. So I want to go back to that chapter that they talked about, but in a different way. So Dan said that, go back to the story of Hagar giving birth to Ishmael. And the moment Sarah finds out, Sarai at that point, that she's pregnant, she says, my esteem, I'm lowered in her esteem. You decide, Abraham. And what does Abraham say? Do whatever you want. And then the Hebrew's terrible. She abused her. That, by the way, is the word used to describe what the Egyptians did to us. They persecuted us. And she runs away, and as she runs away, she sees what? Water. Life-sustaining water. And it's only the ability to see life-sustaining water that gives you life in this culture. Now, remember that every story echoes off previous stories. So that story of her being sent out after a conflict with Sarah, water being the key issue, that's repeated in our chapter here. But this time it plays out differently. This time she is sent out. This time as she is sent out with her boy, who she's witnessing dying, she doesn't see. And you have to ask yourself, why does she see in the first story, and why doesn't she see in the second story? If you followed that, I did that really quick. The reason she doesn't see, I interpret this, in story 2, is because in story 1, she acted out of her own strength and conviction and courage. She was abused and she left. And when you act out of your own strength and your own determination, your own sense of self, you are able to see that which is what is life-sustaining. In the second story, she is acted upon. She loses that voice of independence, that voice of strength, that voice of courage, and she can't see what is right in front of her. Sometimes when you're a parent, you have other responsibilities. There are other things going on. You don't take that initiative that you know you need to take. What initiative do I need to take in order to have my eyes open to that which is life-sustaining? And I want to suggest that as we read this story as the exact same story, a story where she can't see, in fact, she can't look because it is so painful to watch a child of yours dying. And what allows her to see is the deepest lesson that we could possibly find. Go to the next side of the page. Stop it. So she can't see verse 16. Let me not look on as the child dies. She bursts into tears. God heard the cry of the boy. And the angel of God cries to Hagar from heaven and says to her, what troubles you, Hagar? Rabbi Helfand talked about how this is a story of empathy. Sometimes the deepest piece of empathy is not to give someone an answer. The deepest piece of empathy is to ask somebody what is in their heart. So for me, I want to use these high holidays to say, you know what? I need to stop projecting my interpretation and my read of situation, and I need to just ask someone, what troubles you? I need to know where they are at. And then after the question where she is given name, fear not, al-tiri, that word appears over 120 times in the Torah. This is a time, by the way, of great fear. How is it that we respond to fear? God has heeded the cry of the boy where he is. God doesn't hear the boy where God wants him to be, or where we want him to be. God hears the boy where he is at, and then God activates. Come, lift up the boy and hold him by the hand. It's through acting that we find our strength and we find our ability to see. This is a story of empathy. This is a story of activation, and I truly believe that the true response to the fear in the world now, the fear of anti-Semitism, the fear of what's going on in Israel, the fear of what's going on in the Middle East, is to find the action that comes from the empathy. And how do I find the action that comes from the empathy? Take the hand and hold him, and I'll make a great nation of him. And it's only then, when she's learned how to act, because she was listened to, that God opens her eyes and she sees a well. We find our sight through our action. To me, this is an incredible, incredible story of healing that comes as we help, of opening our eyes and seeing what was right in front of us the entire time, through finding the ability to act. And ultimately, it's a story of reconciliation. I love that it has been brought many times that possibly Abraham remarries Hagar. But the twist I want to give you is that right before that, it says that Isaac was at Be'er L'chai Roi. And you're right, Be'er L'chai Roi was exactly where Hagar ran away to. Might the story really have been that Isaac was the one who affected healing between Hagar, his stepmother, who he went to see because she was so hurt, and through that healing and presence was able to bring reconciliation between Abraham and Hagar. And I want to suggest that that woman who is the only person who gives God a name in the whole Torah, you are El Roi, the God who sees me, the God who sees my suffering, that is the reconciliation and return of sight that happens as they come back together. This is a story of seeing each other. And when Abraham and Hagar can't see each other, Isaac, the one who was brutally wounded, helps them to see and rediscover each other. Can we be that person, like Isaac, who might bring people back together who we couldn't imagine ever having come back together? By the way, that's a very hard thing to do. So this is just an incredible story.
Our last teacher is Rabbi Dennis Eisner.
One of the great things about going last is that almost everything has been said. So instead, I'm going to take requests and I'm going to play them. No, I'm not going to do that, but it would be fun. Nothing better than following four terrific teachers, because I get to learn first, and then I have a chance in many ways to incorporate some of their teachings, hopefully, in where I have been thinking, what I have been thinking about this text. For those of you who are part of Reformed congregations, who grew up in the Reformed movement, this text is probably less familiar to you than those who are part of the conservative movement, Orthodox movement, really anywhere outside of Reformed Judaism. Reformed Judaism does not read these texts on the High Holy Days. It is read on the first day on Rosh Hashanah in all shuls outside of Reformed Judaism. In Reformed Judaism, we read the Akedah, we read the binding of Isaac. Second day, we read the story of creation. Second day, in other shuls, they read the Akedah. So for those of you who are wondering why maybe I don't know as much about this, not as familiar, partly it's because in our congregations, we haven't been reading this, but that's also what is so special about what we do here and the way in which we discuss what it is we want to teach. And I'm thankful for being given the task to go back and read this story and become more familiar with it, even for myself. We began the teaching with Rabbi Fieder leading us in the prayer for the study of Torah, where we use the words la'asok b'divrei Torah. The commandment is not to read it, it's not to know it, it's not to understand it, it's not to believe it, it's not to chant it, it's none of those things, but it is to do it. It is to partake in it, it is to busy oneself with Torah. And the great challenge really for all of us as we listen to the different ways in which we can interpret it, the different ways in which we can relate to the stories, to figure out how are we going to do it? How do we take this story? How do we take this story that's complicated and nuanced? How do we take a story that is many areas of it that are problematic, that challenge us in ways that maybe we don't want to be challenged? It challenges us to think of our matriarch Sara in ways that maybe we don't want to think of her. On the other hand, it gives us a chance to think of Hagar, the other, in ways that maybe we ought to think about her. And this is what's so important about a text like this. So many things have been said tonight, and so many things that I've thought of as well, the Midrashim, other texts, and I don't want to rehash that. What I'd like to do is I'd like to now take a look at maybe how we can la'asok b'divrei Torah. How do we engage in this story? We heard about a story where its context is about opening your eyes, about seeing the unseen. How do we make sure that when we're traversing our world, that we're not simply walking by things without really noticing? When do we miss that moment? When do we miss that divine moment? When do we miss that moment when God can be in our presence because we're too swept up in something else?